got Blake set up in the system here, and the whole point of this first stretch is to have the hip flexor stretch, but we're gonna add an anterior glide using a thicker TheraBand. So Blake has this wrapped around, and it's wrapped around his back leg, so he's intending to stretch the right side. So what he's gonna try to do is hike it up basically right to where your hamstring insertion basically goes into that little cleft of your butt, that little flap that you have there. And what's gonna do is the band's gonna wanna pull him towards the unit. And so what he can do, what I want him to focus on when he's doing this hip flexor stretch, as we mentioned in the last one, is actually squeezing that back leg like he's trying to squeeze his glute. And Blake is also doing a really good job of keeping his rib cage down, so he maintains that neutral spinal alignment, so he's not bailing out in any of the other systems, whether it's his knee or his back. And what he should feel is it's kind of gliding that hip a little bit forward, and he's able to get a little bit more added stretch to that. Now when doing this, when you're performing this exercise, I would try to work up to 5 minutes a day, depending on how you want to break it up. So if he wants to do 5 sets of a minute, or if you want to do 10 sets of 30 seconds, just try to work up to more until you feel like that hip is really loosened up. And this is something I would really emphasize. If it's something that's a nagging injury of yours, make it a priority in the early part of your day, but also if he's gonna do it, add it to the end of your workout when you're all done, since this is a static stretch. Second variation to this stretch is actually where we're gonna give a lateral distraction to the hip. So the whole purpose of giving like an accessory motion of the joint, we're working on physiological motion by doing a hip flexor stretch, addressing the muscles. But another way to attack the joint, using these two different variations, is to have an external source kind of try to gap the hip joint. Now, whether or not you're actually getting a true distraction from the joint, it's hard to tell because we don't have an MRI, but the whole point of having this little glide is to kind of give a little bit of separation. This is something we do in the clinic. There's ways to mobilize the hip using some other tools to kind of give that little gap in the hip joint, allows a little bit more freedom to move. So the variation with the lateral distraction of the hip, Blake has the band hiked up basically way up in the crotch, basically right where that adductor insertion's at, and hopefully gliding. And as you can tell, it's kind of hard to balance. So the more you practice this, it'll get a little bit easier. But the same stretch as mentioned before, the technique is exactly the same. You're in that kneeling stretch. As you want to get a little bit more of a stretch, you glide that, you flex that glute, and you try to tuck that pelvis underneath you while keeping the rib cage down, spine nice and erect. Just like with the previous stretch, nothing changes the time at which that you do this under tension. 5 minutes of stretching, totally fine. Everything stays the same.